What dark of the blue? Don't let us hang around this town and let what others say come true. We're just good for nothing. They all figure. Good afternoon, everyone. It is Friday, November 28th. It is 5 p.m. So that must mean I am Jackie Lukman, and this is Darker Than Blue, the show where we talk about politics for the people that you just heard Brother Curtis Mayfield say are darker than blue. I guess you can hear it in my voice, dear listeners. I am not in a great mood today because things that are going on around us, that affect us, that impact us, are really awful, and we are experiencing here in Washington, D.C., another one of those horrible political times that we understand are entirely politically driven and created. The narratives that have been used to justify the deployment of the National Guard here to this city, Washington, D.C., were racist lies. This idea of the National Guard needing to be here to combat uncontrolled violent crime. And we know what that narrative is always about. It's always about poor people. It's always about Black youth. And we know what has happened since their deployment, aside from the fact that what violent crime they have not been fighting violent crime here in DC. They've been picking up trash, they've been looking at their phones, they've been wandering around just kind of chatting with people until this week when an unfortunate and horrific shooting occurred that I'm sure conservatives thought would be the justification for the deployment of the National Guard. But as more details emerge about the perpetrator of the act that has now claimed the life of one of the two National Guardsmen who were shot, we know that the narrative does not, the reality, the facts do not justify the narrative, the lies of violent domestic crime committed by wild and uncontrolled, mostly Black youth here in DC, because the person who carried out this horrific crime was an immigrant from Afghanistan who worked with the CIA in Afghanistan during the 20-year U.S. occupation of that country in the so-called War on Terror that only expanded and increased terrorism by over 1,000% around the world. And this person was involved in a particularly nefarious unit of a secret Afghan army unit that worked specifically with the CIA. And this unit was being paid attention to by the United Nations and human rights groups for vile human rights abuses, the massacre of civilians, the massacre of entire families, false imprisonment, all in the service of working with the CIA and the United States. This secret Afghan army allegedly fighting the terrorism of the Taliban ended up massacring, assaulting, violating the human rights of, abusing Afghan civilians. Right now, there's a whole lot that I can say. There's a lot of commentary I can give about this situation, but I thought, for once, I'm not going to give my commentary on this. I am going to read excerpts of a speech that someone else, much smarter, much wiser, probably, I am sure, a better Christian than I am, gave on April 4th in 1967. Now, that ought to tell you who the speaker is behind this speech, but I'm just going to read some portions of it, not the whole thing, because what was said on April 4th in 1967 by this person, who you ought to know who it is, what this person said back then is absolutely relevant to what is happening right now. So let's not waste any more time. Let's just get into it. This person says, I suppose it is not surprising that I have 7 major reasons for bringing Vietnam, and this is a speech about Vietnam, but I'm going to invite you, dear listeners and dear viewers, to swap out the word Vietnam for the name of any country that the United States has been or currently is involved in conflict with. So this person says, I suppose it is not surprising that I have 7 major reasons for bringing Vietnam into the field of my moral vision. There is at the outset a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. Remember, this was in 1967. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both Black and white, through the poverty program. There were experiments, hopes, and new beginnings. Then came the buildup in Vietnam, and I watched this program broken and eviscerated as if it were some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and to die in an extraordinarily high proportion relative to the rest of the population. He's talking about the poor. We were taking the Black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. So we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools. So we watch them in brutal solidarity burning the huts of a poor village, but we realize that they would hardly live on the same block in Chicago. I could not be silent in the face of such cruel manipulation of the poor. My third reason moves to an even deeper level of awareness, for it grows out of my experience in the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years. Remember, again, this was in 1967, especially the last 3 summers. As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I've told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I've tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they asked, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They asked if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. for the sake of those boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of the hundreds of thousands trembling under our violence, I cannot be silent. What about Iraq? I'm asking this question now. What about Grenada? What about Puerto Rico? What about Niger? What about Sudan? What about Afghanistan, which have particular relevance for DC's Black youth, who are targeted in this National Guard deployment to combat alleged crime that's really a dragnet for those Black youth, while the psychological wages of the 20-year war on terror in Afghanistan were brought to the streets of DC this week. We cannot just say that the National Guard shouldn't have been deployed in DC because the claim of rampant youth crime is a lie. That's true. But now we have to see the connections between U.S. militarism abroad and violence of those who carried it out over there, bringing it back to these streets. If you haven't figured out who this speech is from, it is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he continues in another portion of this speech, Beyond Vietnam. He says, for those who ask the question, aren't you a civil rights leader and thereby mean to exclude me from the movement for peace? I have this further answer. In 1957, when a group of us formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we chose as our motto to save the soul of America. We were convinced that we could not limit our vision to certain rights for Black people, but instead affirm the conviction that America would never be free or saved from itself until the descendants of its slaves were loosed completely from the shackles they still wear. In a way, we were agreeing with Langston Hughes, he says, that Black bard of Harlem, who had written earlier, "Oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be." Now, it should be incandescently clear that no one who has any concern for the integrity and life of America today can ignore the present war. If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. It can never be saved so long as it destroys the deepest hope of men the world over. So it is that those of us who are yet determined that America will be are led down the path of protest and dissent, working for the health of our land. As if the weight of such a commitment to the life and health of America were not enough, another burden of responsibility was placed on me in 1964. And I cannot forget that the Nobel Peace Prize was also a commission to work harder than I had ever worked before for the brotherhood of man. That is a calling that takes me beyond national allegiances. My, how far that award has fallen in such a short period of time. But he goes on to say, Dr. King, in this speech, but even if it were not present, I would yet have to live with the meaning of my commitment to the ministry of Jesus Christ. To me, the relationship of this ministry to the making of peace is so obvious that I sometimes marvel at those who ask me why I am speaking against the war. Could it be that they do not know that the good news was meant for all men, for communists and capitalists, for their children and ours, for Black and for white, for revolutionary and conservative? Have they forgotten that my ministry is in obedience to the one who loved his enemies so fully that he died for them? What then can I say to the Viet Cong or to Castro or to Mao as a faithful minister of this one? Can I threaten them with death, or must I not share with them my life? Finally, he says, as I try to explain for you and for myself the road that leads from Montgomery to this place, and this place at that time in 1964 on April 4th was Riverside Baptist Church, where he made this speech in New York. He said, I would have offered all that was most valid if I simply said that I must be true to my conviction that I share with all men the calling to be a son of the living God. Beyond the calling of race or nation or creed is this vocation of sonship and brotherhood, because I believe that the Father is deeply concerned, especially for his suffering and helpless and outcast children. I came tonight to speak for them. This I believe to be the privilege and the burden of all of us who deem ourselves bound by allegiances and loyalties which are broader and deeper than nationalism and which go beyond our nation's self-defined goals and positions. We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for the victims of our nation, for those it calls enemies, for no document from human hands can make these humans any less our brothers. And as I ponder the madness of Vietnam and search within myself for ways to understand and respond in compassion, my mind goes constantly to the people of that peninsula. I speak now not of the soldiers of each side, not of the ideologies of each side, because it's clear to me that there will be no meaningful solution there until some attempt is made to know them and hear their broken cries. And here, this is my commentary here. Here, King does what so few Black and other leaders do today. He talks about the history of US interference in Vietnam on the side of the colonial powers. We don't understand what's going on in the world today and why it's happening because US politicians and leaders in every institution do not tell the truth about what this government has done to create or influence the problems they also say they need the military to solve. So King says they must see Americans, they meaning the people that the US government calls its enemies, they must see Americans as strange liberators. The Vietnamese people proclaimed their own independence in 1945 after a combined French and Japanese occupation and before the Communist Revolution in China. They were led by Ho Chi Minh. Even though they quoted the American Declaration of Independence in their own document of freedom, the United States refused to recognize them. Instead, the United States decided to support France in its reconquest of her former colony. Our government, King calls the US government our government, felt that the Vietnamese people were not ready for independence, and we again fell victim to the deadly Western arrogance that has poisoned the international atmosphere for too long. With that tragic decision, we rejected a revolutionary government seeking self-determination and a government that had been established not by China, for whom the Vietnamese had no great love, but by clearly indigenous forces that included some communists. For the peasants, this new government meant real land reform, one of the most important needs in their lives. For 9 years, King continues, following 1945, we denied the people of Vietnam the right of independence. For 9 years, we vigorously supported the French in their abortive effort to recolonize Vietnam. Before the end of the war, we were meeting 80% of the French war costs, even before the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu. They began to despair of their reckless action, but we did not. We encouraged them with our huge financial and military supplies to continue the war, even after they had lost the will. Somebody say Ukraine right here. Soon, we would be paying almost the full costs of this tragic attempt at recolonization. After the French were defeated, it looked as if independence and land reform would come again through the Geneva Agreement. But instead, there came the United States, determined that Ho Chi Minh should not unify the temporarily divided nation, and the peasants watched again as we supported one of the most vicious modern dictators, our chosen man, Premier Diem. The peasants watched and cringed as Diem ruthlessly rooted out all opposition, supported their extortionist landlords, and refused to even discuss reunification with the North. The peasants watched all of this. And all of this was provided over by the United States influence and then by increasing numbers of United States troops who came to help quell the insurgency that Diem's methods had aroused. Excuse me. When Diem was overthrown, they may have been happy, but the long line of military dictators seemed to offer no real change. Excuse me, especially in terms of their need for land and peace. Excuse me. The only change, Dr. King said, came from America as we increased our troop commitments in support of governments which were singularly corrupt, inept, and without popular support. All the while, the people read our leaflets and received the regular promises of peace and democracy and land reform. Now they languish under our bombs and consider us, not their fellow Vietnamese, the real enemy. They moved sadly and apathetically as we herd them off the land of their fathers into concentration camps where minimal social needs are rarely met. They know they must move or be destroyed by our bombs, so they go. Primarily women and children and the aged, they watch as we poison their water, as we kill 1,000,000 acres of their crops. They must weep as the bulldozers roar through their areas, preparing to destroy their precious trees, or olive trees, as in Palestine. They wander into the hospitals with at least 20 casualties from American firepower for one Viet Cong inflicted injury. So far, we may have killed 1,000,000 of them, mostly children. This was in 1967. Dr. King says this. They wander into the towns and see thousands of the children, homeless, without clothes, running in packs on the streets like animals. They see the children degraded by our soldiers as they beg for food. They see the children selling their sisters to our soldiers, soliciting for their mothers. What do the peasants think as we ally ourselves with the landlords and as we refuse to put any action into our many words concerning land reform? What do they think as we test our latest weapons on them, just as the Germans tested out new medicine and new tortures in the concentration camps of Europe? Where are the roots of the independent Vietnam we claim to be building? Is it among these voiceless ones? We have destroyed their two most cherished institutions, Dr. King said, the family and the village. We have destroyed their land and their crops. We have cooperated in the crushing of the nation's only non-communist revolutionary political force, the Unified Buddhist Church. We have supported the enemies of the peasants of Saigon. We have corrupted their women and children and killed their men. And I have to depart again here. The height of hypocrisy that King is calling out here screams into what is going on in this country and around the world today, because we have white Christian nationalists in the US screeching about protecting family values, protecting children from predators and transgender people and gay marriage and being indoctrinated by wokeness, while celebrating murdering brown, Muslim, peasant, socialist, communist families all over the world for centuries to control the resources on those people's land. These are the people who have no family values. Not the socialists, not the communists, not the Muslims. It's the people who support and target other groups of people with US imperialism and militarism to steal from them and to kill those people to get those resources if they have to. King goes on to say, perhaps a more difficult but no less necessary task is to speak for those who have been designated as our enemies. What of the National Liberation Front, that strategy, that strangely anonymous group we call the VC or communists? What must they think of the United States of America when they realize that we permitted the repression and cruelty of DM, which helped to bring them into being as a resistance group in the South? What do they think of our condoning the violence which led to their own taking up of arms? How can they believe in our integrity when now we speak of aggression from the North as if there were nothing more essential to the war? How can they trust us when now we charge them with violence after the murderous reign of DM that, again, this government supported and propped up, and charge them with violence while we pour every new weapon of death into their land? Surely we must understand their feelings, even if we do not condone their actions. Surely we must see that the men we supported pressed them to their violence. Surely we must see that our own computerized plans, this was in 1967, that our own computerized plans of destruction simply dwarf their greatest acts. Here, I also must point out that King is talking about cause and effect that was surely ignored after 9/11, Iraq, and Afghanistan, which led us precisely to this moment. Excuse me. King goes on to say, how do they judge us when our officials know that their membership is less than 25% communist and yet insist on giving them all that blanket name? What must they be thinking when they know that we are aware of their control of major sections of Vietnam, and yet we appear ready to allow national elections in which this highly organized political parallel government will not have a part? They ask how we can speak of free elections when the Saigon press is censored and controlled by the military junta that the US supports. And they are surely right to wonder what kind of new government we plan to help form without them, the only party in real touch with the peasants. They question our political goals, and they deny the reality of a peace settlement from which they will be excluded. Their questions are frighteningly relevant. Is our nation planning to build on political myth again and then shore it up upon the power of a new violence? King is asking these questions in 1967. He goes on to say, here is the true meaning and value of compassion and nonviolence. When it helps us to see the enemy's point of view, to hear his questions, to know his assessment of ourselves. For from his view, we may indeed see the basic weakness of our own condition. And if we are mature, we may learn and grow and profit from the wisdom of the brothers who are called the opposition. So I'm going to pause right here to give us a chance to absorb, to breathe, because it's just about time for a station break. So let's take a little minute to step back, take a drink, and hear what our engineer extraordinaire has on tap for the people this week.
Inviting all DC hand dancers, Philly boppers, Chicago steppers, Carolina shaggers, and West Coast swingers. The Treehouse Dreamers venue offers dance music from Motown and more every Friday, 1 to 5 p.m. at 4722 14th Street Northwest. DJ Jam and Dave and other fine DJs provide an atmosphere offering seniors socialization while getting much needed quality movement to familiar tunes and dance every Friday. Details at 301-922-4064. That's 301-922-4064. WPFW offering wellness through dance, one activity at a time.
All right. So let's not waste any more time. Thank you so much for that fantastic announcement. Let me continue with the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He says, so too with Hanoi. In the north, where our bombs now pummel the land and our mines endanger the waterways, we are met by a deep but understandable mistrust. To speak for them is to explain this lack of confidence in Western words, and especially their distrust of American intentions now. In Hanoi are the men who led the nation to independence against the Japanese and the French, the men who sought membership in the French Commonwealth and were betrayed by the weakness of Paris and the willfulness of the colonial armies. It was they who led a second struggle against French domination at tremendous costs, and then were persuaded to give up the land they controlled between the 13th and 17th parallel as a temporary measure at Geneva. After 1954, they watched us conspire with Diem to prevent elections, which could have surely brought Ho Chi Minh to power over a united Vietnam, and they realized they had been betrayed again. When we ask why they do not leap to negotiate, these things must be remembered. A little aside, once again, folks, what peace will there be in Palestine if Palestinians are not involved in the alleged peace plan, or in Sudan, or in Congo? This is just another U.S. occupation plan that comes from the same arrogant hypocrisy that King is describing the U.S. had in and toward Vietnam. He goes on to describe U.S. foreign policy and previews the current and lasting evil, even in Palestine, when he says, Hanoi remembers how our leaders refused to tell us the truth about the earlier North Vietnamese overtures for peace. How many times has the US media lied to you about how many times Hamas actually agreed to come to the table and talk to? Yeah. King goes on to say how the president claimed that none existed when they had clearly been made. Ho Chi Minh has watched as America has spoken of peace and built up its forces, and now he has surely heard the increasing international rumors of American plans for an invasion of the North. He knows the bombing and shelling and mining we are doing are part of traditional pre invasion strategy. So if y'all think Dr. King was just a silly black Christian pastor who was only concerned with thoughts and prayers, you did not understand how well this man understood the connection between the struggle against imperialism and the struggle for peace internationally. He goes on to say, perhaps only his sense of humor, he's talking about Ho Chi Minh still, perhaps only his sense of humor and of irony can save him when he hears the most powerful nation of the world speaking of aggression as it drops thousands of bombs on a poor, weak nation more than 8,000 miles away from its shores. King could be talking about Venezuelans here, Cubans, Panamanians, Colombians, as the Department of War murders Caribbeans in small boats, claiming they're drug traffickers. U.S. leaders are still not telling us the truth about any of these things while committing vile acts of murder against sovereign peoples and their nations and building up the machinery of war once again. And at this point, excuse me, King continues to say, I should make it clear that while I've tried in these last few minutes to give a voice to the voiceless in Vietnam and to understand the arguments of those who are called enemy, I am as deeply concerned about our own troops there as anything else. For it occurs to me that what we are submitting them to in Vietnam, and again, y'all, replace Vietnam with the name of a country that the U.S. is involved in or implicated in anywhere in the world, He says Vietnam is not simply the brutalizing process that goes on in any war where armies face each other and seek to destroy. We are adding cynicism to the process of death, for they must know, he's talking about the troops in Vietnam now, for they must know after a short period there that none of the things we claim to be fighting for are really involved. Before long, they must know that their government has sent them into a struggle among Vietnamese, and the more sophisticated surely realize that we are on the side of the wealthy and the secure while we create a hell for the poor. Excuse me. Now, dear listeners and viewers, what did the National Guard members deployed to DC feel when they were told they were here to combat violent crime, but ended up picking up litter off the street, harassing teenagers on Halloween night, and now end up being targeted, not by uncontrollably psychotic Black criminals run amok, but by a product of their own government's continued degradation of people in other countries? They deployed to DC to fight crime and ended up targeted by a former partner in the US's bloody, misguided, and anti Muslim war on terror. And it's going to fuel another wave of anti Muslim hate and warmongering. That's certainly not the crime they were sent to DC and other US cities to fight, but that's the crime they are faced with this week. King goes on to say, of the members of the U.S. military engaged in these awful acts of U.S. imperialist aggression and destruction, he says, as we counsel young men concerning military service, we must clarify for them our nation's role in Vietnam or Venezuela or Cuba or Mexico or Colombia or Palestine or Sudan or Congo or Southeast DC or Baltimore, and challenge them with the alternative of conscientious objection. I'm pleased to say that this is a path now chosen by more than 70 students at my own alma mater, Morehouse College, and I recommend it to all who find the American course in Vietnam a dishonorable and unjust one. Moreover, I would encourage all ministers of draft age to give up their ministerial exemptions and seek status as conscientious objectors. These are the times for real choices and not false ones. We are at the moment when our lives must be placed on the line if our nation is to survive its own folly. Every man of humane convictions must decide on the protest that best suits his convictions, but we must all protest. The King was not just talking about protest here, dear listeners and viewers, but clear strategic action for the faith community and for everybody else, particularly the military. These demands to disobey unjust orders are not only not new, but they are morally just and legally protected acts of resistance. King knew that then, and it's a doggone shame we do not loudly proclaim that this is true today, but are instead cowering under Trump's threats. King was much more prescient than we give him credit for. But that's why too few people know this speech in full. What King says next is an evisceration of American worship of capitalism at the expense of dignity and human life, and how it's all connected to conflicts in multiple countries that we've heard about before now and are still hearing about today because this country is still greedy and heartless. So King continues by saying the war in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. And if we ignore this sobering reality, and if we ignore this sobering reality, we will find ourselves organizing clergy and laymen concerned committees for the next generation. They will be concerned about Guatemala and Peru. They will be concerned about Thailand and Cambodia. They will be concerned about Mozambique and South Africa. We will be marching for these and a dozen other names and attending rallies without end unless there is a significant and profound change in American life and policy. So such thoughts take us beyond Vietnam, but not beyond our calling as sons of the living God. In 1957, a sensitive American official overseas said that it seemed to him that our nation was on the wrong side of a world revolution. During the past 10 years, King said, we have seen emerge a pattern of suppression, which has now justified the presence of U.S. military advisors in, wait for it, y'all, Venezuela. He said this in 1967. This need to maintain social stability for our investment accounts, for the counter revolutionary action of American forces in Guatemala. It tells why American helicopters are being used against guerrillas in Cambodia and why American napalm and Green Beret forces have already been active against rebels in Peru. It is with such activity in mind that the words of the late John F. Kennedy come back to haunt us. 5 years ago, he said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. Increasingly, by choice or by accident, this is the role our nation has taken, King said, the role of those who make peaceful revolution impossible by refusing to give up the privileges and the pleasures that come from the immense profits of overseas investments. I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. This is why we don't take pieces of comments out of the context in which they were said, because when he said, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values, he said it in the context of challenging and destroying capitalism, because that's what he's talking about here. He continues by saying, we must rapidly begin in 1967 the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, people-centered human rights. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will be only an initial act. One day, we must come to see that the whole Jericho Road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. King said a true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. With righteous indignation, it will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of the countries and say, this is not just. It will look at our alliance with the landed gentry of South America and say, this is not just. The Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. And this, dear friends, what King just said is the essence of analyses from people like Walter Rodney in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America, 5 centuries of the pillage of a continent condensed into that one statement. King goes on to say, a true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of peoples normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields, physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. And this is when Dr. King says, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. America, the richest and most powerful nation in the world, can well lead the way in this revolution of values. There is nothing except a tragic death wish to prevent us from rendering our priorities, or from reordering our priorities, so that the pursuit of peace will take precedence over the pursuit of war. There is nothing to keep us from molding a recalcitrant status quo with bruised hands until we have fashioned it into a brotherhood. Admittedly, dear friends, King talked as if he was opposed to communism, like much of America was and still is, because we're all indoctrinated to believe that it's an evil, particularly ungodly expression of hatred of America. But as Dr. King talks about communism in terms of warmongering, imperialism, and human dignity and human rights, and in terms of that indoctrination in a common sense and pragmatic way, he speaks to the unreasonable response to communism in the US and the West. Because he says this kind of positive revolution of values is our best defense against communism. War is not the answer, he says. Communism will never be defeated by the use of atomic bombs or nuclear weapons. Let us not join those who shout war and, through their misguided passions, urge the United States to relinquish its participation in the United Nations. These are days which demand wise restraint and calm reasonableness. We must not engage in a negative anti-communism. Let me say that again. Dr. King said on April 4th, 1967, we must not engage in a negative anti-communism, but rather in a positive thrust for democracy, realizing that our greatest defense against communism is to take offensive action in behalf of justice. King said we must, with positive action, seek to remove those conditions of poverty, insecurity, and injustice, which are, King said, the fertile soil in which the seed of communism grows and develops. There's a whole lot I can say about communism and the biblical narrative about the early church and how they established themselves and whether communism is evil or not and all this kind of stuff. But King understood that communism grows out of the demands of the poor for equality and justice. And if we look at the Bible in Acts chapters 2 and 4, we see that's exactly how the early church was established, when they all got together in this new belief in Jesus Christ and took everything they owned, sold it all, put all the money into a pot, and redistributed all of that money equally among everybody in the society. I'm not sure if Dr. King equated what was done in the early church in Acts 2 and 4 with communism, but we all know that's what it is. So I just want to make that clear that there is that consistency with communism as a legitimate expression of equality and justice in the economic sustainment of a society right in the Bible. All right. But I needed to point out that Dr. King, while he is narrating the nation's attitude toward communism, his focus is, All right, whatever you feel about it, understand where it comes from. And if you don't like communism, maybe do something about poverty and inequality and injustice. Because if you make this society more equal, why would you have a problem with anybody else's society doing what they need for their people? Dr. King continues by saying these are revolutionary times. All over the globe, men are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression, and out of the wounds of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. He's saying this right after he's saying not to express a negative anti-communism. He even understands that communism and socialism emerge from people who were oppressed fighting against the old unjust systems. He says the shirtless and barefoot people of the land are rising up as never before. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. We in the West must support these revolutions, King says. It's a sad fact that because of comfort, complacency, a morbid fear of communism, he says, and our proneness to adjust to injustice, the Western nations that inherited so much of the the Western nations that initiated so much of the revolutionary spirit of the modern world have now become the arch anti-revolutionaries. Now we have to remember, dear friends, that at that time, everybody believed the same lies about the United States being the great purveyor of revolutionary struggle for liberty and all of that kind of stuff. Because I think we did not have as mature, most of us did not have as mature of an understanding of capitalism and imperialism as we've certainly developed over the years. And like I have had to be reminded a few times that Dr. King was on an obvious journey of greater understanding of this system as it existed. And this is why this speech, the Beyond Vietnam speech, delivered on April 4th in 1967 at the Riverside Church in Manhattan, New York City, is so incredibly important to who he was and his work, because this speech was delivered exactly 1 year before he was assassinated. And this was the speech in which he, as you can hear, in which he raised up the problems with American imperialism, U.S. warmongering, the lies about U.S. warmongering and the history of U.S. involvement in other countries, the reason the U.S. really gets involved in other countries, and it's not because of capitalism and socialism, or it's not because of socialism and communism, it is because of capitalist profit. And of course, now Dr. King, when he makes this speech, he's no longer a thorn in the side of the U.S. Capitalist duopoly. Now he is a threat. He is a threat to the capitalist ruling class. He is a threat to the imperialist world order. So, of course, he couldn't be allowed to live when he, one of the premier Black leaders of the time, stands in a church in the middle of New York City in front of 3,000 people and condemns the system that this nation is built on, that it exports the oppression that it heaps upon us, exports it all around the world at the barrel of a gun, and pours it in bombs and bloody invasions and coups among the working class and poor and peasant people of the world to steal from them, because it just makes them a lot of money to do it. So I, excuse me, really thought it incredibly important for us to hear not my opinions about what's going on today, but what Dr. King said about the certainty that we would reach this moment in the history of this country if we didn't do something about what got us into Vietnam in 1967. We are where we are in this country and in the world because the ruling class has never listened to the people who were put here to help us get on the right track. That's why we're here. So I am wondering, as I always ask at the end of my show, what are you going to do now? When you understand that these issues that we are facing domestically and around the world are not only not new, but back in 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did more than talk about a dream. He talked about the nightmare that this government and capitalism has created for poor people here and around the world. What are you finally going to do to stop this? I'm out of time. Thank you so much for joining me. I am sure we will be here next week to continue fighting. And until next time, y'all, a luta continua. The struggle continues, and it will continue until we actually fight together. But if we do that, if we actually fight together and fight the enemy, which is U.S. imperialism and capitalism and connected Zionism, if we do that together and start to do it right now, Victoria Acerta. Victory is certain. Peace, everyone.